Thank you for being with us this morning. For the past few weeks, we've been focusing on the story of two sisters that have a surprise, unexpected visitor in Jesus. And the two different sisters have two different responses when this unexpected visitor shows up. One is busy doing all the responsible things, taking care of the house, getting things ready, getting things organized, maybe getting a meal ready. And the other one is sitting there with the guests, sitting there with Jesus. And the one who was busy and distracted and worried about any and everything didn't like how the scenario was going down, and so she complains to Jesus. And this is this interaction between Martha and Jesus from Luke's gospel. Martha, she had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." How many of us could replace Martha's name with our name and hear the words from the Lord saying, "Luke, Luke, you are worried and distracted by many things"? How many of us could say, this is a sentence that describes me? I assume the number is fairly high. Many of us get so worried and distracted that we miss the people that are right in front of us. They're right in front of us. Martha did it with Jesus, and we do it all the time with people who also have in them the image of God. There was a study in 2013 where psychologists got two strangers in a room together and asked them to strike up a conversation about something that happened in the last month. And they actually had different groups have two different experiences. And they found that there was one group that was sitting across from someone who was a stranger to them, talking about what happened in the last month. And the person seemed to be more empathetic and more trusting, and the relationship seemed to be more meaningful than the other group. Because the group that saw the other person as more trustworthy and empathetic were sitting at a table, and the only thing on the table between them and the other person was a notepad. Them, a notepad, the other person, that's all it was. But the group that saw the other person that they had just met, that they were talking about what they had experienced the past month, and saw them as being less trustworthy and less empathetic, had on the table not a notepad, but a cell phone. They weren't talking on the phone, it was just a cell phone sitting on the table, which caused them to see the stranger as having less empathy and having less trustworthiness. Just by having a phone on the table, they were distracted. And you've probably experienced this. You go to lunch with someone, you sit down and they put their phone on the table, not down, but right side up. And you know that there is a whole world of distraction that's right there between you and the other person. There's something causing there to be a fracture between the relationship just by the mere presence of a phone. There was a really disturbing study done by a psychologist named Edward Trask, in which he had a caretaker, a parent, and an infant act out this scenario, where the parent would start to act disengaged. The experience that many of us have if you're trying to talk to someone and there's a cell phone in front of them. And this is the results of that. Here's actually a clip of this experience.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Now you know what I feel like when you guys don't laugh at my jokes. The experience is called still face. When the baby sees the adult, the parent, having a still face toward them, they act like that. And we kind of do the same thing. When you don't get the response you're expecting or you need, it affects us. There's actually been some meta-analysis of data from 1979 to the year 2009 over empathy studies with young adults. And what they found from the year 1979 to the year 2009 is that there was a steady decrease in empathy with young people. And there's some speculation, this is my speculation, that as we grow up communicating with our peers through digital means, through text messaging, through instant messages, through direct messages, what we learn to do is communicate without any regard for the feedback we get from someone else's facial expressions. And so as a kid, part of the way that we learn how to socialize is if you say this thing or you make this joke, then you see what it does to the other person. But when you don't have that instant feedback to what your communication does to someone else, it creates this dysregulation and a lack of understanding and empathy for other people's experience. Another way to say that is we become distracted by this medium of communication that impedes communication. It's the way of this age. It's part of the conversation about screen-based technology. But we're not trying to say all screen-based technology is bad by any means. Now, the word technology, there's many definitions, but the one we talked about last week is that technology is simply the application of scientific knowledge for practical purpose. It's the application of scientific knowledge for practical purpose. That's what technology is. But usually what we mean by the word technology is something that was created after we were a teenager. No one thinks a pen and paper are technology, though functionally it actually is. But we mean something that's new to us. And in many ways, technology has increased the ability to have immediate communication, even over the last few decades. When I was in high school, I had a long-distance relationship with a girlfriend who was in college in Arkansas. And for me to talk to her, it caused very expensive phone bills because long-distance calling was a very real thing. It was as expensive then as it would be today to talk to someone from a different planet. And I know some of you are thinking Arkansas still feels like a different planet, but I would never say that that's offensive. But now we can communicate immediately and conveniently. If you think back to plots of movies from 30, 40 years ago, many of them don't hold up. Some of you over the Christmas holiday watched the movie Home Alone. It came out in 1990. You have this little boy, he gets left at home, and they can't communicate with him. If he has a cell phone, if the neighbor has a cell phone, the whole movie falls apart. Because now there is immediate communication. But immediate communication is not the same thing as meaningful communication. Immediate does not mean meaningful. The former United States Surgeon General Vivek Murthy said in a piece that he wrote in the Harvard Business Review in 2017 that when he was seeing patients, the most common issue he dealt with, the most common pathology he dealt with was not diabetes or heart disease, but loneliness. The most common situation was loneliness. Cheryl Turkle, who is a psychologist at MIT, I think accurately described the phenomenon of our present day, the spirit of this age, with a title for her TED Talk, which was a few years ago. And the title was Alone Together. Alone Together. We have immediate communication, but that doesn't mean it's meaningful communication. We can be like Martha. We're in the same space as other people digitally, but that doesn't mean we're at their feet. It doesn't mean we're connected to them. The kind of love that God wants us to have is with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our soul, with all of our strength. But that's not what we experience, and that's not what we always give. We can give immediate communication, but that doesn't mean it's meaningful. And ultimately, I feel like that's the spirit of this age. Last week, we talked about a story that is essentially based upon technology, even though it might not seem like it from the first glance. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 11, you have a group of people that decide that we don't want to be scattered, but we want to make a name for ourselves. We're going to build this big tower and storm into the gates of heaven. And the technological advancement that enables that is the brick. With the invention, the scientific application, the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, which was the building of a brick, and enabled them to build structures far more expansive and impressive than they could without a brick. But the technological advancement enabled their already present arrogance to grow. And the end result of trying to storm the gates of heaven is that eventually a group of people no longer has the ability to communicate. They can't communicate anymore. All they can do is babble back and forth to each other because now there are many languages, as God has divided the tongues of all people. Now, with that as the backstory, let's get to our text today from Acts chapter 2. If you're physically able, would you please stand for the reading of God's word? When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, in our own language, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" The word of the Lord. Please be seated. And they ask, what does this mean? So now you have a group of people who all have different languages, and they come together, and somehow everyone can hear in their own native language. And so people are saying, what does this mean? Now, for some context, Pentecost is 50 days after the Passover. In the Jewish mind, what happened at Pentecost is God gave the commandment. God gave the 10 Commandments. The law was given to the Israelites. And now at the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the new law is brought to God's people. And the way that the new law is brought to God's people is the Spirit of God, which is now creating something new. This is a redoing of Genesis chapter 1. Let's go to the next slide. In Genesis 1, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a mighty wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Genesis 1, pre-created world, there's just waters, there's just chaos, and then the Spirit of God hovers over it. Acts 2, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind. Acts 2 is retelling Genesis 1 because this is a new creation. And the new creation is happening by this wind, this pneuma, this Spirit of God, which is coming down on to humanity. Because what's creating something new in a world that has been divided by arrogance at the Tower of Babel is now being undone and recreated with this new law, not written on stone tablets, but on human hearts, because the Spirit of God is changing things. It's making things new. Because the solution to a world that's divided and broken is not for us to try harder to be away from our screens. It's not for us to get rid of cable. It's not for us to never have Wi-Fi anymore. The solution is not for us just to try better with our phones. The solution is the Spirit of God. Because the Spirit of God enables us to hear. Because for a Christian, true hearing does not originate in our ears, but in our hearts where the Spirit of God dwells. The solution to our problems isn't us just trying harder. The solution is God's Spirit at work within us. A couple years ago, Ramjan, who many of you guys know, was just up here a second ago with me, told me that he was doing a comedy show here in Austin. And he said, Luke, I want you to come participate. And my first thought was, a comedy show in Swahili or Kinyarwanda is a perfect place for dry sarcasm to translate. And so Ramjan suckers me into going to this, and I'm there and try not to make a fool of myself, and I look out, and I see Rebecca and Steve Baker, among many of you. And I saw Steve Baker laughing during the whole thing. And I don't know how much better Steve Baker's Swahili or Kinyarwanda was better than mine. I don't think it was much better. But he was laughing and having a good time. In the same way that I've been up in the international class many times, and I've seen Steve Baker singing and dancing along in a language that he probably doesn't understand too much better than I do. And I've seen him celebrating. I've seen him at parties with the international group. And even if he didn't know Swahili perfectly, he had something that enabled him to translate across different languages. Because true hearing doesn't come from the ears, but it comes from the work of God's Spirit in the heart. Love has a way to translate across different languages. Because real hearing isn't about our ears, it's about the work of God's Spirit within us. In the same way, when I was in Abilene studying, I had one of my professors named Charles Seibert who was legally blind. But one of the things about Dr. Seibert is that he could see and perceive what was happening in any room better than just about any person I ever met. Because true seeing doesn't come from the eyes for a Christian, but it comes from the work of God's Spirit within our hearts. The work of the Spirit is the solution. Because God is able to do immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine according to the power that is at work in you, which is the Spirit of God. And so when the early church sees this and Acts 2 happens, and they go, what does this mean? The answer is, God's Spirit is here. That's what we mean. And so in verse 12, the end of this text that we just read, people are amazed and perplexed. They're amazed and perplexed because the spirit of this age is divided. But the Spirit of God it's unifying. It's unifying. A couple years ago, I was out in Southern California for Pepperdine's Bible lectures. And I stayed over a day because our friend Fade Haygood invited me to preach at his church. Some of you remember Fade. He's preached here probably 3 times in the last couple years. And Fade lives down in Compton. And so I'm staying over to go preach at his church. And the night before, they put me up at a hotel in Redondo Beach. And I'm going to go preach in Compton. And so I go to this restaurant. I'm there by myself just eating dinner. And the guy sits next to me, and he starts trying to talk to me, which I wasn't necessarily in the talking mood. And so he keeps talking about, what are you doing? What are you doing? I was like, I'm going to play the preacher card. Because one of 2 things happen when you play the preacher card. Either they go into everything about their life story, or they just stop talking to you. It's never the middle, it's one or the other. And I felt like this was a never talk to me again kind of thing. And so I turned to him and I said, actually, I'm here because I'm preaching tomorrow for my friend Fade, who lives down in Compton. And what happens next, I need a caveat because my daughter's in the room. Whenever I use the word hell in the sermon, my daughters always go, Dad, you curse in the sermon again. And I try to explain to them, when I'm a preacher, I'm allowed to say the word hell, okay? It's a special caveat I get. You don't get it, I do get it. But I tell this guy that I'm preaching for my friend in Compton. The guy looks at me and goes, he goes, man, you're white and you look young as hell. And he's not a preacher. He's not allowed to say that word. And then I'm kind of stuck because in my professional training, I don't think hell is very new. I don't think it's very young. So I'm kind of confused by that. And then I realized that what he's looking at is going, you're a white boy and you're going to preach for a guy in Compton. It doesn't make sense. And what he didn't realize, what was perplexing to him, is how a community of followers of Jesus could be so gracious and hospitable to me, even though I look a little different from them. Because he didn't understand the work of God's Spirit, which doesn't work like the spirit of this age, which units us, which is, you're like this and we're like that, and so we divide. But the Spirit of God unifies. It's perplexing to people who don't understand, and they go, what does this mean? Because they don't understand what the Spirit of God is doing. It's not like the spirit of this age. It's different. If we go back to verse 8, you look at this list of different places that they mention, and I don't know how many of you actually have your Bible maps out, and so you don't get what's happening here because I don't get it either. But the common equivalent of the experience of the initial audience would be like this. If I said people from Seoul and Brisbane and Tomsk, Russia, and London, and Cape Town, and New York, and Mexico City, and San Francisco, and Honolulu. What they're listing here is from east to west. What this list is describing is how this is universal. It is for everyone, all the way from the east, all the way to the west, that everyone is a part of this. And that's what the Spirit of God does, but the spirit of this age, it's like we're going to have our little pocket of people. We're going to have our own little bubble. This is just our people. I've got an uncle who lives in West Texas, and he looks like he's straight off the set of Yellowstone. He's like the Marlboro Man. Very large man, loves his Wranglers. Whenever I was a kid, I would hug him, and I would get like the button snaps kind of stuck to my face. You know, that kind of hug? Very large man. It looked like he had like a broom right above his lip because he had an amazing mustache. Good old West Texas boy. Once I tried to put, when I was a teenager, ketchup on a steak that he cooked for me. He almost killed me. Which I, as an adult now, respect that decision on his part. It would have been completely understandable. Amen to that. He goes to a cowboy church. And that's a great start for many people. People like him, who dress like him, who talk like him, who sing like him. And I love that they're cowboy churches because it's a great place for certain people to start their Christian journey. To go, these people are like me and they talk my language and they get where I come from and they dress like me. They listen to the same music as me. They have big trucks just like me. And the same way I have friends who are part of very liberal churches where they have certain issues that they post about and certain issues they care about and certain issues they advocate for. And I love that there are churches like this that are a great start for people because it speaks their language and it speaks to things that they care about and things that they believe in. And it's a great start. But I hate to be critical of other Christians, but how much different are these little bubbles than the rest of our world? Where we'll do church as long as you look like me and you talk like me and you sound like me. If you vote like me, we're cool. If you dress like me, we're cool. If you believe certain things are most important like I do, we're cool. And it's just like a normal filter bubble you'll find online. One of the reasons that Facebook was recently evaluated at $327 billion, and the Alphabet company, which is the holding company for Google, is worth so many billions of dollars, is because they found unique ways to monetize a specific experience for you and I online. They create what's commonly known as a filter bubble, where what you experience online is uniquely crafted just for you. And so what you experience online is not all, but just alike. And these are things that talk like you and think like you and believe like you. And so what you end up thinking is that everyone thinks just like you. And sure, there are some people that you're mad at because they're completely wrong, but your people all sound and think and look just like you. And that's the spirit of this age. It's filter bubbles. And no one is ever going to be amazed or perplexed at how these groups get together. No one's amazed or perplexed. Go, wait, how come you are together? You guys all think alike. Because that's just how the spirit of this age works. One of the things that's so problematic to me about the phrase conservative Christian or progressive or liberal Christian is inevitably the second word seems to carry more weight. The first word carries more weight than the second word. where we're more identified by the word progressive or liberal than conservative, or conservative instead of the word Christian. When you have to use an adjective before the word Christian, you inevitably dilute what the word Christian means to you. Because Christian can't be identified with how you vote or your political leanings. It's bigger than that. But when you live in a filter bubble world that reflects the spirit of this age, it inevitably happens. But the Spirit of God is doing something different. It doesn't just speak to little units, it speaks universally to everyone. So if you want to live in the Spirit, let me give you one thing you can do. It's one of the subtle things that Acts chapter 2 actually highlights. It uses the same word 3 times. In Acts chapter 2, you see this word repeated 3 times. First in verse 6, and then 8, and then verse 11. It's the word hear. For as much as it is about speaking, I think the emphasis with this word's repetition is actually the true heart of Acts chapter 2. At the sound, they gathered in a large crowd, but they were confused because each one heard. Then how does each of us hear? But both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, yet we hear. The key is not what is spoken, the key is what is heard. There's an old parable about a rabbi and 3 disciples. They're walking all day, and Rabbi's teaching, and eventually the rabbi goes back to his place to sleep at night, and then the 3 disciples are there covered in the dust of the rabbi, and they start talking to each other. And one says to the other, I'm very sorry that the rabbi was just talking to me today. I'm sorry he left you out. And then the second one said, no, I'm sorry to you two because rabbi was just talking to me. And then the third one says, no, guys, I'm sorry that the rabbi ignored you because he was speaking just to me. And many times we can't hear that the rabbi is speaking to all of us. We think it's just to me. And we think, well, the rabbi just speaks to those of us from the churches of Christ. Or the rabbi just speaks to Baptists, or the rabbi just speaks to Catholics, or the rabbi just speaks to Episcopalians, or the rabbi just speaks to the Lutherans. And we forget that the Spirit is speaking to everyone. And the way that we become a kind of community that leaves the world amazed and perplexed is if we no longer live in the spirit of this age, which is division, but instead we live in the Spirit of God, which brings unity. And the solution is to be just like Mary. If you want to live in the Spirit, you end up being just like Mary. If we go back to Luke's gospel, it says this about Mary. Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. If you don't want to be distracted and worried by a divided world, the solution is to listen to what the rabbi is saying. And the way that we listen to the rabbi is through the work of the Spirit inside of us. And if you do that enough, what happens is you start to reflect the Spirit. And so in your life, you start to experience love and joy and peace and patience and generosity and faithfulness and goodness and self-control. And the fruit of the Spirit is displayed in you in such a way that the world goes, what does this mean? Because the solution to our divided and worried world is the Spirit of God. And so as much as we're talking about technology in this series, don't be confused. The answer is not for us just to get rid of our phones. It's not just for us to log off of Facebook. The answer is for us to lean into the Spirit of God, because that's what set the early church apart. And it can be what sets you and I apart today. It's the Spirit inside of us, together, and it unifies us. So as we continue in worship, what we're going to do now is we're going to receive communion. And last week we did something that we hadn't done in a while, where we passed trays. And so in just a second, I'm going to invite the students again to make their way to the back to receive the trays. And what we're going to do again this week, like we did last week, is different than before, is I'm going to invite you to receive the bread and the cup and hold on to it. And then eventually everyone's going to have the bread and the cup, and then we're going to receive it together. Because I don't know about you, but when your family eats, you don't just take your food and start eating as soon as you get it, but you wait for everyone to receive their meal. And so as a unified family, we're going to receive the bread and we're going to receive the cup, and then we're going to wait And then in a second, I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to pray over this, and we're going to receive it together to reflect that we are all receiving this together. So I'm going to invite the students to make your way now. They're going to start serving at the top of the room and then at the bottom of the room, and they're going to pass the trays accordingly. Now, this is different, and so some of us are going to have a difficult time getting both cups out because the bread is in one cup and the juice in the other cup. And so you might need to help your neighbor. Please be considerate of other people as we do this. But receive this bread and receive this cup. And I invite you to say this little prayer with me as you wait and prepare your hearts. And the prayer is this: Spirit, have your way with me. Spirit, have your way with me. Spirit, have your way with me. Spirit, would you have your way with me? Spirit, would you have your way with me? Let's receive.